A bullet to the groin ended Carl Switzer's life for a reason unbelievably cheap: a debt of exactly $50. No one expected the man bleeding to death on that floor to be Alfalfa, the legendary spiky-haired boy of the Little Rascals, who was once the childhood of the world, but was stripped of his halo and cast aside by the entertainment industry the moment his innocence faded. His death was not just a tragedy, it was a master class in erasure. The police investigation moved with suspicious speed, eager to close the file on a messy Hollywood casualty. Crucial inconsistencies at the crime scene were overlooked in favor of a convenient narrative, leaving a Hollywood icon to fade into the shadows of a forgotten crime scene. He died, as he had lived in his final years, in chaos, misunderstood, and utterly alone. The story of how Carl Switzer was discovered is often retold as a charming anecdote of Hollywood luck. In reality, it was an act of aggressive, almost manic desperation. The year was 1934. The Switzers had arrived in Los Angeles. They had no agent. They had no connections. They had no money for a formal audition. Fred and Gladys Switzer took the boys on a sightseeing tour of the Hal Roach Studios in Culver City. This was the kingdom of comedy, the home of Laurel and Hardy and our gang, the Little Rascals. The studio had a commissary, a cafeteria open to the public where studio executives and stars would eat lunch. It was a place of business, buzzing with producers making deals. The Switzers couldn't afford a meal there, but they knew Hal Roach, the studio head, frequented the spot. Fred Switzer gave his sons an order. It wasn't a suggestion. He told them to go into the cafeteria and perform. Imagine the scene through the eyes of the patrons. People are trying to eat their lunch. Suddenly, two skinny, dust-covered boys from the Midwest burst into the room. They don't just sing, they scream, they stomp, they dance violently. They refuse to stop. This was not a polished performance. It was a frantic plea for survival. The boys knew that if they didn't get attention, they didn't eat. This moment established a psychological baseline for Carl Switzer that would last the rest of his life. It was a form of Pavlovian conditioning. He learned at 6 years old that his value as a human being was entirely dependent on his ability to make a spectacle of himself. Quiet behavior meant poverty and invisibility. Loud, obnoxious behavior meant attention and food. Hal Roach was eating lunch that day. He didn't see refined talent in the screaming boys. He saw raw energy. He saw a lack of inhibition that was rare even in child actors. He laughed. He signed both brothers on the spot. For Harold, the older brother, it was a job, but for Carl, the younger and more intense of the two, it was the beginning of an identity that would consume him. He wasn't Carl anymore. He was Alfalfa. Hal Roach Studios was known as the Lot of Fun. On screen, the Little Rascals seemed to inhabit a world of perpetual summer, makeshift go-karts, and innocent crushes. Behind the scenes, it was a factory. In the 1930s, the laws protecting child actors were rudimentary at best. The Coogan laws existed to protect some earnings, but there were few regulations regarding working hours, psychological safety, or physical comfort. Carl Switzer entered this machine at age 7. He was instantly popular. His face, open, freckled, with wide, expressive eyes, was a cinematographer's dream. But the studio needed a hook. They needed something to make him visually distinct. They created the Alfalfa look. This look was not natural. It was a feat of industrial engineering applied to a child's body. The famous cowlick, the single stalk of hair standing straight up, is one of the most iconic images in film history. But hair does not naturally stand up like that for 12 hours a day under hot lights. To achieve the look, the hair and makeup department used a mixture of heavy waxes, concentrated sugar water, and often industrial-grade adhesives. Every morning, Carl sat in a chair while adults plastered this chemical mixture onto his scalp. It dried into a hard, crusty shell. It blocked his pores. It caused chronic itching and scalp inflammation. But he was forbidden from touching it. If he scratched, the hair would fall. If the hair fell, the shot was ruined. If the shot was ruined, the studio lost money. So Carl learned to sit still while his head burned. He learned to smile through the itch. Filmmaking in the 1930s required immense amounts of light. The studios used carbon arc lamps. These were not cool LED panels. They were essentially open-flame arcs that generated blistering heat. Temperatures on the set often exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 degrees Celsius. The children were often dressed in heavy wool suits, blazers, or costumes. They sweated profusely. They were constantly dehydrated, but they had to look fresh. Between takes, makeup artists would dab the sweat off Carl's face, apply more powder, and push him back under the heat. A typical day began at sunrise and ended long after sunset. While there were technically requirements for schooling, they were often ignored or crammed into 10-minute breaks while the cameras were being reloaded. Carl was working harder than most adult factory workers. He was memorizing lines, hitting marks, and managing the emotional continuity of a scene, all while sleep-deprived and physically uncomfortable. The physical discomfort was manageable. The psychological manipulation was damaging. Directors of the comedic shorts in the 1930s did not view children as little adults with complex emotions. They viewed them as props that could talk. They didn't have the time or patience to coax a method performance out of a 7-year-old. They needed a reaction, and they needed it now. This era utilized what can be described as pain-based directing. If a script called for Alfalfa to look surprised, disgusted, or tearful, the director would not ask him to imagine a sad story. They would inflict a physical stimulus to force the biological reaction. There is a notorious account from the set that perfectly encapsulates this method, often cited by cast members and historians alike, the gum incident. As the story goes, in one scene, the director needed Alfalfa to look like he was struggling, choking back tears, or reacting to a bad taste. The crew gave Carl a piece of chewing gum. To a child, gum is a treat. Carl trusted them. He put it in his mouth. The gum had allegedly been laced with cayenne pepper or a heating oil. Instantly, his mouth was on fire. The mucous membranes burned. His eyes watered involuntarily. He began to cough and sputter. "Action!" the director yelled. The cameras rolled. The crew laughed. Millions of Americans in theaters laughed. They were not laughing at acting. They were laughing at a child's genuine physiological response to a chemical burn. This betrayal of trust taught Carl a dark lesson. The adults who claimed to care for him, the family on set, were actually his tormentors. They would hurt him to get a laugh. If physical tricks didn't work, psychological terror did. Carl was acutely aware of his family's financial situation. His parents made sure he knew that he was the breadwinner. If he was tired or cranky or couldn't get the line right, the assistant directors would lean in and whisper the ultimate threat: "Do it right or we'll find another kid and your family will starve." For a child who had seen the Dust Bowl, this wasn't an abstract threat. It was a threat of death. Psychologists speak of a mechanism called identification with the aggressor. When a child is powerless and subjected to cruelty, they often try to regain a sense of control by becoming the cruel one. Carl Switzer absorbed the violence of the studio system and reflected it back onto the world. By the time he was 10 years old, the sweet Alfalfa was a myth. Off camera, Carl Switzer was becoming a terror. The stories of his behavior are legendary in Hollywood, often retold as pranks. But looking at them through a modern lens, they weren't pranks. They were acts of calculated sadism. They were the symptoms of a behavioral disorder caused by his environment. He didn't just put whoopee cushions on chairs. He escalated to dangerous physical traps. Carl became known for putting fish hooks in the back pockets of the crew members. He would wait, stone-faced as a cameraman or a grip sat down. The hook would drive into their flesh. The man would scream in agony. Carl didn't laugh like a child, having fun. He observed. He watched the pain he caused with a detached, cold curiosity. It was a transfer of power. For a brief moment, he was the one inflicting the pain, not the one receiving it. He urinated into the ventilation systems and onto the hot carbon arc lights. When the lights heated up, the studio would fill with the acrid stench of burning urine, forcing production to shut down for hours. To the studio, this was money lost. To Carl, it was a victory. It was the only way he could stop the machine. His co-stars grew to despise him. George "Spanky" McFarlane, the de facto leader of the group, later said in interviews that Alfalfa was the most difficult child he ever knew. They fought constantly. There was no camaraderie off-screen. Carl Switzer was a child soldier in a war for profit. He had been radicalized by the process. He learned that pain equals comedy and humiliation equals success. He was building a shell of aggression to protect the frightened boy inside. But the studio system had one final fatal trap waiting for him. It is the trap that catches all child stars eventually. Time. But the studio system, for all its power to manipulate behavior and warp psychology, had one adversary it could not bribe or bully: biology. As the 1930s drew to a close, the chemical glue in the hot lights continued to do their work. But the raw material, Carl's body, began to rebel in a way that no director could yell "cut" on. The factory had perfected the child, but it had no use for the man he was becoming. In the manufacturing of a child star, biology is the enemy. For Hal Roach Studios, Alfalfa was a product with specific specifications. He was small, he had a high-pitched, cracking voice, and he was physically awkward. These were the features that sold tickets, but in 1940 the product began to malfunction. Carl Switzer turned 13. Puberty is a difficult time for any child, but for Carl, it was a career-ending injury. His defining comedic tool, that squeaky, unpredictable voice, dropped into a standard baritone. The gangly awkwardness that was cute at 7 became ungainly and threatening at 13. He grew tall rapidly. The freckles faded. He was no longer a little rascal. He was a teenager. In a healthy environment, a child is guided through this transition. In the studio system of the 1940s, there was no transition plan. There was only termination. The studio executives looked at the dailies and realized the magic was gone. The juxtaposition of a small boy acting like a sophisticated adult was funny. A teenager acting like a teenager was boring. Carl Switzer was fired. He wasn't just losing a job, he was losing his entire identity. Since the age of 6, he had been conditioned to believe that his only worth lay in being Alfalfa. He had no education to fall back on, due to the sham schooling on set. He had no social skills with peers his own age. He had no money, as his parents had spent most of his earnings on living expenses and the migration from Illinois. At 14 years old, Carl Switzer was a retiree with no pension, cast out into a world he didn't understand. Throughout the 1940s, Carl tried desperately to remain in the only world he knew. He refused to accept that it was over. He auditioned constantly, but he quickly ran into the typecasting wall. When casting directors looked at him, they didn't see an actor who could play a romantic lead or a tough soldier. They saw Alfalfa, They saw the kid with the cowlick. They expected him to cross his eyes and sing off key. When he tried to play serious roles, audiences giggled. The ghost of his childhood character stood in front of him, blocking every opportunity. He managed to secure bit parts in B-movies, often playing street toughs or delinquents. He appeared in a series called The Gas House Kids, which was a low-budget knockoff of The Bowery Boys. It was humiliating work, recycling the same shtick for a fraction of the pay. There is one moment from this era that stands out, a cultural touch point that millions have seen but few recognize as Carl Switzer, the It's a Wonderful Life incident, 1946. In Frank Capra's classic film, there is a famous scene at the high school dance. George Bailey, James Stewart, is dancing with Mary, Donna Reed. In the background, a character named Freddie is scheming. He is the guy who turns the key to open the retractable floor, revealing the swimming pool underneath. The dancers fall in. Chaos ensues. That character is Carl Switzer. Watch the scene again. He is playing the disruptor. He is the agent of chaos. He is the jealous, petty outsider who ruins the moment for the beautiful people. Even in adulthood, Hollywood would only hire him to destroy things. He was not allowed to be the hero. He was the prankster who pulled the lever. It was a meta-commentary on his own life. The former star now relegated to the background, pulling the rug out from under the new stars. By the 1950s, the acting work had evaporated almost entirely. The arrival of television offered a few guest spots. He appeared on The Roy Rogers Show, but they were fleeting. Carl Switzer was a young man in his 20s, but his spirit was aging rapidly. He was angry. The bitterness of his stolen childhood began to curdle into a deep resentment of authority. He married in 1954 to a woman named Diantha Collingwood. They had a son, but the marriage collapsed quickly, lasting only 4 months. Carl was not equipped for domestic life. He was volatile, prone to mood swings, and increasingly dependent on alcohol. Alcohol became the anesthesia for the pain of irrelevance, but it also fueled his aggression. The pranks of his childhood evolved into bar brawls. He was known to be a mean drunk. He would pick fights with people bigger than him, driven by a self-destructive urge. He began to take jobs that were increasingly removed from the glamour of Hollywood. He worked as a bartender. This was a specific kind of torture. Patrons would recognize him. "Hey, aren't you Alfalfa?" They would wave dollar bills in his face. They would demand he do the Alfalfa croak. They wanted him to sing, "I'm in the mood for love," in that brokey voice. And Carl, broke and desperate, would do it. He would dance for his supper just like he did in the commissary at age 6. He humiliated himself for tips, reviving the ghost of the boy he hated for the amusement of strangers. As Hollywood turned its back on him, Carl turned his back on civilization. He found solace in the wilderness. He began working as a professional hunting guide. He led wealthy clients into the mountains of the Sierra Nevada to track bears and mountain lions. Psychologically, this shift is fascinating. As a child, Carl was the prey. He was hunted by directors, hunted by parents, hunted by the schedule. He was powerless. In the mountains, he became the hunter. He carried a gun. He controlled the life and death of powerful animals. He tracked. He dominated. He was good at it. He was comfortable in the dirt and the cold. It was the only place where no one cared about his hair or his voice. A bear doesn't know who Alfalfa is. But even in the wilderness, he couldn't escape the loser narrative. The depth of Carl's poverty became public knowledge just 1 month before his death. It was Christmas time, 1958. Carl was broke. He needed money for food and alcohol. He drove into the Sequoia National Forest. He illegally cut down 15 pine trees, intending to haul them back to the city and sell them as Christmas trees for a few dollars each. He was caught by park rangers. The headlines were merciless. Little Rascal arrested for stealing trees. He was sentenced to probation and fined $225. He didn't have the money. The humiliation was total. The boy who had once earned thousands of dollars a week was now a petty criminal, stealing state property to survive the holidays. This brings us to January 1959. The final sequence of events was set in motion not by a grand conspiracy, but by a trivial, almost pathetic dispute. Carl had been training a hunting dog, a blue-tick coonhound, for an acquaintance named Moses Bud Stilts. Bud Stilts was a welder, a tough man, and a sometimes partner in Carl's hunting business. During a training run, the dog ran away. This was a disaster for Carl. He was responsible for the animal. Desperate, he put out flyers offering a $35 reward for the dog's return. A few days later, a local man found the dog and called Carl. Carl was relieved. He drove to the man's house, paid the $35 reward, and then, in a burst of manic gratitude, and likely fueled by alcohol, he took the man to a bar. He bought $15 worth of drinks to celebrate the dog's return. The math of death, reward paid, $35, plus drinks bought, $15, equaled $50. In Carl's mind, warped by years of feeling cheated by the alcohol and by the desperation of his poverty, he decided that this $50 loss was not his fault. He decided that Bud Stilts, the owner of the dog, owed him that money. He convinced himself that Stilts had to reimburse him. $50. Adjusted for inflation, it is approximately $500 today. It is a small sum. But for Carl Switzer, it was everything. It represented the last shred of his dignity. He had paid for the dog. He demanded to be made whole. Stilts refused to pay. He argued that Carl lost the dog, so Carl had to pay the reward. This petty argument festered in Carl's mind for days. It grew into an obsession. He told friends he was going to get his money. He told drinking buddies he was going to beat it out of Stilts if he had to. On the night of January 21st, 1959, Carl started drinking early. He called up his friend, a photographer named Jack Piot. They shared a bottle. The rage built up. "We're going to Mission Hills," Carl said. "We're going to get that $50. He wasn't going to a business meeting. He was going to a confrontation. He didn't know it, but he was driving toward his own execution. The decision was made. The engine started. As the car rolled toward Mission Hills, it was no longer just a vehicle. It was a transport hurtling toward a violent conclusion that had been scripted years prior. The $50 was merely the MacGuffin. The real cargo was a lifetime of accumulated rage, seeking a target. The drive to Mission Hills that night was a journey into the dark heart of the suburban American dream. It was just after 7 p.m. when Carl Switzer and Jack Piot pulled up to the modest home on Rita Street. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where people watched television after dinner and mowed their lawns on weekends. It was not a place built for violence. But inside the car, the atmosphere was toxic. Carl was drunk, he was broke, and he was fixated on the idea that he was being robbed of $50. To him, this wasn't just a debt, it was a symbol of every studio executive, every casting director, and every person who had ever exploited him. Inside the house, Moses Bud Stilts was waiting. He wasn't naive. He knew Carl Switzer. He knew that when Carl drank, the alfalfa charm evaporated, replaced by a nasty, unpredictable aggression. Stilts was a welder, a man who worked with his hands, and he wasn't the type to be intimidated. Earlier that evening, he had told his wife and his 14-year-old stepson, Tom Corrigan, to go into the back bedroom. He sensed trouble coming. When he heard the car pull up, he didn't call the police. He reached for a .38 caliber revolver. Carl pounded on the front door. The sound shattered the evening silence. When the door opened, the threshold became a collision point between two desperate men. The accounts of exactly how the entry occurred vary. Stilts would later claim Carl forced his way in, kicking the door open while others suggested he was let in. Regardless, within seconds, Carl Switzer and Jack Piot were standing in the living room. The air was thick with tension. "I want my $50, Carl demanded. Stilts stood his ground, the gun likely tucked away or held low at this point. He told Carl to get out. He told him there was no money. But Carl wasn't listening. He was performing again, but this time the audience was hostile. He screamed. He postured. The argument escalated rapidly from shouting to shoving. Then the violence erupted. It wasn't a choreographed Hollywood fight with clean punches and dramatic pauses. It was a messy, drunken brawl. Carl lunged at Stilts. They grappled. Stilts was a strong man, but Carl was fueled by manic rage. Jack Piot joined the fray, turning it into a 2-on-1 assault. The three men crashed around the small living room, knocking over furniture. In the chaos, the physics of the fight took a sharp, fatal turn. The brawling men slammed into a piece of furniture. Some reports say a glass-fronted clock, others a bookcase. The glass shattered. A jagged shard sliced into Bud Stilts' forehead, opening a deep gash above his eye. Head wounds bleed profusely. Within seconds, blood was pouring down Stilts' face, blinding him in one eye. This is the pivot point of the tragedy, according to the official narrative. In the confusion, pain, and blindness, Stilts' perception of reality warped. He felt the sharp pain and the warm blood, and his mind leaped to the worst conclusion. I've been stabbed. Stilts panicked. He believed he was fighting for his life against a man who had just knifed him. He managed to break free from the grapple. He raised the .38 revolver. The sight of the gun changed the dynamic in the room instantly. According to the police report filed that night, Stilts fired a warning shot into the ceiling. The bullets slammed into the plaster, filling the room with dust and the deafening roar of gunpowder. But Stilts claimed the warning failed to deter the aggression. He told police that Carl, fueled by alcohol and rage, continued to advance, forcing him to make a split-second decision to protect his life. Stilts pulled the trigger again. The bullet struck Carl in the groin, tearing through the lower abdomen and severing the iliac artery. It was a gut shot, painful, messy, and devastating. The impact knocked Carl backward. The screaming stopped. The fighting stopped. There was only the sound of a man struggling to breathe, and the smell of gunpowder mixing with the iron scent of blood. Carl Switzer, the boy who had made millions laugh, lay curling up on a stranger's carpet. He reportedly looked at Stilts with shock and murmured something about the pain. The internal bleeding was catastrophic. The iliac artery is a major pipeline. When it is severed, the body loses blood volume rapidly. Carl's vision would have blurred. The cold that he had felt all his life, the cold of the soundstage, the cold of the mountains, would have overtaken him completely. By the time the ambulance arrived, Carl Switzer was practically gone. He was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital. The police secured the scene. They took statements. Bud Stilts, battered and bleeding from the head, told his story, self-defense against a violent home invasion, and the physical evidence seemed to support him. Under the body of Carl Switzer, the police found a hunting knife. Stilts pointed to it and said, "He tried to kill me with that." The detectives did the math. They saw a dead drunk actor, a homeowner with a bleeding head wound, and a weapon found under the deceased. They accepted Stilts' account. The narrative was set. Alfalfa had gone crazy, and a man had defended his castle. The autopsy was clinical. It detailed the trajectory of the bullet and the alcohol content in his blood, but it failed to note the tragedy of the timeline. Carl Switzer had survived the Great Depression, the abuse of the studio system, and the wilderness. but he could not survive the crushing weight of his own pride and a $50 debt. He died at 31 years old. The silence of the living room was soon replaced by the scratching of pens and the shuffling of papers. In Hollywood, death is usually the start of a legend, but for Carl Switzer, it was the beginning of a bureaucratic erasure. The visceral violence of the act was about to be sanitized by the indifference of the state, turning a bloody tragedy into a neat administrative dismissal. The Los Angeles judicial system did not convene a grand murder trial. There was no media circus at the courthouse steps. Instead, the fate of Bud Stilts was decided by a coroner's inquest, a procedural hearing designed to determine whether a crime had likely been committed. It was less of a trial and more of a formality. The inquest took place just days after the shooting, on January 25th, 1959. Bud Stilts took the stand, his head still bandaged from the fight. He cut a sympathetic figure, a working man, a father defending his home. He recounted his version of events with a steady conviction. He described the forced entry, the terror of being blinded by his own blood, and the belief that he was being stabbed. The jury listened. They looked at the evidence presented by the police, specifically the knife found under the body. To the jury, the presence of the weapon confirmed the narrative. Carl was armed, therefore, Stilts was justified. Their verdict was unanimous and decisive: justifiable homicide. Bud Stilts walked out of the hearing a free man. There would be no prison time. There would be no probation. As far as the state of California was concerned, killing Carl Switzer was a legally acceptable act. The case was closed before the ink on the death certificate was dry. While the legal system was dismissing Carl's death, the media was inadvertently erasing it. By a twist of fate that would seem heavy-handed in a screenplay, Carl Switzer died on January 21st, 1959, the exact same day as the architect of Hollywood himself, Cecil B. DeMille. DeMille was the emperor of the industry, the director of the Ten Commandments. When the newspapers went to print the next morning, the editors had a choice, and it wasn't a difficult one. The front pages belonged to the legend. Tributes poured in from presidents and studio heads. Carl Switzer's violent end was pushed to the margins, buried on page 16, sandwiched between tire advertisements and supermarket coupons. Some reports misspelled his name. Others ran headlines that were unintentionally cruel, such as "Little Rascal Shot in Dog Dispute." Even in death, he was denied the spotlight. He was the B-plot to DeMille's blockbuster finale. Because of this eclipse, there was no public outcry, no investigative journalism. The world was too busy mourning the king to care about the jester. The funeral was held a few days later. It was a stark contrast to the funerals of other stars of his era. When Rudolph Valentino died, women fainted in the streets. When Carl Switzer was laid to rest, the turnout was thin. It was mostly family, his grieving parents, Fred and Gladys, who had brought him to California 25 years earlier with dreams of gold, and his older brother, Harold. There were a few former cast members from our gang, but the turnout was sparse. The industry that had made millions off his face did not send its executives. There were no studio heads delivering eulogies about his genius. He was buried at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery, but for decades there was no monument to mark his resting place. The Switzers, broken by the failure of their Hollywood gamble and destitute, could not afford a headstone. For years, the boy who had been the most famous face in America lay under a patch of nondescript grass, indistinguishable from the earth around him. He was anonymous in death, just as he had feared becoming in life. In the years following his death, the silence around Carl Switzer solidified. Hollywood moved on, but rumors began to circulate. In the dark corners of Hollywood history, People began to whisper about the curse of the little rascals. They pointed to Carl's violent death, and then they looked at the others. They looked at William Buckwheat Thomas, who died of a heart attack at age 49. They looked at Darla Hood, who died of hepatitis at 47. But if you strip away the supernatural gloss of a curse, you find something far more tangible, a control group of children subjected to identical forms of systemic neglect. Carl Switzer was not the victim of bad luck. He was the victim of an industrial machine that had no exit strategy for its raw materials. This pattern was not unique to our gang. Consider Bobby Driscoll, the voice of Peter Pan and the star of Treasure Island. Like Carl, he hit puberty, developed acne, and was discarded by Disney. Years later, police found a body in an abandoned tenement in New York. It was buried in a pauper's grave on Hart Island. It took months to identify him as the Oscar-winning child star. When you line up these biographies, Switzer, Beckett, Driscoll, the curse reveals itself as simple, brutal economics. These children were raised in a reward-punishment environment where their value was tied to their cuteness. When the cuteness faded, the industry cut the cord, leaving them with no education, no coping mechanisms, and an addiction to adrenaline that normal life could not satisfy. Carl Switzer's aggression, his drinking, and his obsession with the $50 were symptoms of the same disease that killed Scotty Beckett and Bobby Driscoll. They were hollow men, built by a corporation to perform a function, and then left to rust when the function was obsolete. We must also return to the other boy in the cafeteria that day in 1934, Harold Switzer. Harold was the older brother. He was the slim to Carl's Alfalfa. He was signed on the same day. He endured the same hot lights, the same poverty threats, and the same parents. But Harold didn't become the star. He was a background player. He watched his younger brother rise to national fame, and he watched him fall into infamy. Harold's life after Hollywood was quiet. He operated a laundry franchise. He tried to be normal. But the Switzer legacy of tragedy was inescapable. In April 1967, 8 years after Carl was shot, Harold Switzer was working as a dryer repairman. He had embroiled himself in a dispute that mirrored Carl's, a conflict with a partner that turned violent. After killing a customer in a dispute, details remain murky and often buried in local records. Harold drove to a remote area near Glendale. He parked his car, wrote a note, and took his own life. The Switzer family had come to California with 2 sons, hoping to strike gold. They ended up with 2 dead men, one murdered, one a suicide, both victims of a life that never gave them a solid foundation. The cafeteria performance had bought them food in 1934, but the bill came due in 1959 and 1967. Carl Switzer fits a specific tragic archetype in American pop culture, the disposable boy. We see this figure repeat throughout history. He is usually working class. He is usually discovered rather than bred for fame. He is usually comedic or odd-looking rather than classically handsome. From Bobby Driscoll to Corey Haim and Brad Renfro, the pattern is identical. Extraction, dependency, the awkward phase, acting out, and finally, the discard. Carl Switzer was the prototype. He was the first high-profile example of what happens when you turn a child into a SKU, stock keeping unit, and then discontinue the line. When he stood in Bud Stiltz's living room demanding $50, he wasn't just asking for cash. He was demanding a residual. He was demanding a return on the investment of his childhood. He felt the world owed him something. And in a cruel twist of irony, the world decided that his life was worth exactly $50. For 42 years, the death of Carl Switzer was a closed book. The official record stated justifiable homicide. The public record stated self-defense. The cultural record stated crazy alfalfa. got what he deserved. But history has a way of leaking out. In January 2001, a man named Tom Corrigan finally decided to break his silence. He was 56 years old, a grandfather, and living a quiet life. But back in 1959, he was the 14-year-old boy trembling in the hallway of the house on Rita Street. He was the stepson of the shooter, Bud Stilts. Corrigan gave an interview to police investigators who were revisiting cold cases and Hollywood lore. His testimony dismantled the official narrative of self-defense and painted a picture of a cold-blooded execution. According to the official 1959 report, Stilts shot Switzer during the heat of the struggle while terrified and blinded by blood. Corrigan's 2001 account diverged significantly. Corrigan confirmed the struggle and the glass breaking, but he stated that after the glass broke, his stepfather managed to retrieve the gun. He fired a warning shot into the ceiling. This shot changed the psychology of the room. The loud report of the .38 stunned everyone. The fighting stopped. Jack Piat shouted, "Don't shoot," and scrambled for cover near the kitchen. Carl Switzer, realizing he was staring at a loaded gun, stopped advancing. He began to retreat. He backed toward the front door. He held up his hands. According to Corrigan, Carl said, "I'm leaving. I'm going." The fight was over. The threat was neutralized. The intruder was leaving. But Bud Stilts was not done. Corrigan described his stepfather as being in a state of cold rage. The blood was in his eyes, yes, but the warning shot had given him control. As Carl backed up, clearly surrendering, Stilts tracked him with the barrel of the revolver. Corrigan watched as his stepfather pulled the trigger a second time. There was no lunge. Carl Switzer was shot while retreating. He was shot while surrendering. Under California law, you cannot shoot a fleeing intruder who no longer poses an immediate threat. If Corrigan's testimony is true, this was not self-defense. It was second-degree murder or voluntary manslaughter. Corrigan also shed light on the smoking gun of the defense, the hunting knife. He suggested that the knife found under Carl's body was indeed Carl's, but it was found closed. This crucial detail supports the theory that the knife likely slid out of his pocket during the scuffle or was merely present on his body, never deployed as a weapon. How does a man attack with a folded blade? The presence of the closed knife suggests that the deadly weapon, Stilts feared and the police accepted, was never actually in play. Why didn't the boy speak up in 1959? He was 14. The killer was his stepfather, the man who put food on his table, the authority figure in his house. The police didn't press him. The coroner didn't call him to the stand. The system wanted a clean resolution. Convicting a homeowner for killing a washed-up drunk child star would have been messy. It would have required a trial. It would have required effort. Accepting the self-defense story was easy. It fit the prejudices of the time. Tom Corrigan lived with that secret for decades. When he finally spoke, it was too late for justice. Bud Stilts had died in 1983. The case could not be reopened. The verdict stands forever as justifiable, even though history now knows it was likely anything but. To find the true cost of this fame, one must leave the television set and walk into the quiet, sun-baked rows of the cemetery, where the final chapter of this tragedy is carved in stone. If you visit the Hollywood Forever Cemetery today, you will find yourself in one of the most glamorous locations of the afterlife. It is the final resting place of titans: Judy Garland, Rudolph Valentino, Douglas Fairbanks. It is a place where tourists wander with maps, seeking the graves of the gods of cinema. Carl Switzer is there too. When a headstone was finally erected years later, paid for by the Hollywood Forever Masonic Lodge, it bore a specific design chosen to honor his legacy. It features the square and compasses of the Masons, his name, his dates in one dominant image. It is not a portrait of Carl. It is an engraving of a dog. Specifically, it is Pete the pup, the dog with the ring around his eye from the Little Rascals. The symbolism is devastating. Carl Switzer died in a violent dispute over a hunting dog. He was killed because of a dog. And now he spends eternity branded by a dog. It serves as a poignant reminder that his identity remained forever tethered to the franchise. The human being, the man who loved, suffered, and bled, is absent. Only Alfalfa, the boy who played with the dog, remains. Even in death, he is a supporting character to a franchise. Unlike the death of Rusty Hamer, which sparked a revolution in child labor laws, the Coogan account reforms, the death of Carl Switzer changed nothing. In 1959, the industry did not look at Carl's body and say, "We must protect children better." They looked at his body and said, "See, that's what happens when you're a bad kid." Carl Switzer was dismissed as an anomaly. The industry framed his death as the result of personal moral failure, drinking, fighting, hunting, rather than systemic neglect. They didn't blame the lack of education that left him with no skills. They didn't blame the pain-based directing that desensitized him to violence. They didn't blame the lack of financial residuals that left him fighting over $50. Because the industry refused to accept responsibility, the machine kept running. It continued to chew up children like Scotty Beckett, Bobby Driscoll, and later, the stars of the 1980s. Carl Switzer was the canary in the coal mine, but when the canary died, the miners just stepped over him and kept digging. The Greeks separated theater into two masks, comedy and tragedy. Carl Switzer's life reveals the horrifying truth that for child stars, these masks are often sewn together. To the audience, Alfalfa was pure comedy. He was the lovable loser. He was the boy who sang off-key to Darla. He represented the innocence of a scrappy American childhood. To Carl, Alfalfa was tragedy. Alfalfa was the cage he grew up in. Alfalfa was the reason his hair was glued, his mouth was burned, and his education was stolen. Alfalfa was the ghost that haunted every job interview he went to as an adult. The tragedy of the funny kid is that they are not allowed to be sad. When a dramatic actor cries, they get an Oscar. When Alfalfa cried, the director yelled "cut" and told him to do it funnier. He was conditioned to believe that his pain was only valuable if it made someone else laugh. On that final night in Mission Hills when he was bleeding out on the floor, there was no laugh track. The silence of that room was the first honest moment of his life. The story of Carl Switzer is not a Hollywood mystery. It is an American tragedy. It is the story of a boy who screamed for his supper in a cafeteria and never stopped screaming until the gun went off. The next time you see the boy with the freckles and the cowlick, do not just laugh. Look at his eyes. You are looking at a child who is working a 12-hour shift in a factory of make-believe, unaware that the machinery is slowly crushing him to death.